But this immunity case, David, it really defies. I was talking to David K. Johnston in the first hour, and he was mentioning it as well, that this really defies even your legal analysis of predictions, which have been pretty spot on. You thought they'd knock this back down to the lower court. They wouldn't lean into this immunity issue quite the way they have. And there is really no one I can think of, and as I say, I include David K. Johnston, who thought that they would lean into this immunity issue this way and really change American life and the course of the presidency in this fashion.
Well, I had a feeling, actually, Mark, that they would. Because you and I did a show on Nixon versus Fitzgerald, and I was kind of like the skunk at the picnic. I probably depressed a lot of our viewers, but Nixon v. Fitzgerald is a case that I emphasized, and I tried to, because there was so much rhetoric that this was all outrageous and the president was holding himself up as a king and there was no precedent for it. How could this be happening? And I did alert people to the fact that this Nixon v. Fitzgerald case, which is one that holds the president immune even after his office has been served, even after his or her time in office, a president after the president's term cannot be sued. And I mentioned then during a show that we did about it that it was, in my opinion, a case where they should have allowed Nixon after he was president, and he resigned in as much disgrace as any. He left the presidency in as much disgrace, and so there was sort of a feeling that this is a guy not worth protecting, his presidency. And this Fitzgerald seemed to have a righteous case that he had been picked. It was by a bad presidential motive. It looked like the president wasn't really terminating him because he hadn't done a good job. All he'd done was taken a position about its cost overrun. And the Republicans and Nixon wanted this defense system to go through. And Fitzgerald had said, no, there are these big overruns. And he testified in Congress. He wasn't one of those people who ran around all the time, and tried to sort of blast the president. He was called to testify. He had testimony that hurt Nixon. Nixon got him fired. Nixon said bad things about him. He sued Nixon after Nixon was president, and they said Nixon had total civil immunity. So the question in this case was going to be whether the president had total criminal immunity. The case went 5-4 after Nixon's presidency. The 4 dissenters said, are you kidding me? We're going to go this far. Are we also going to go to criminal immunity? So there actually was some background, as horrible as it seemed, that there would be a decision in this regard. What I had said was that they were definitely going to send the case back to define part of the conduct as official and part of it as private. And so I don't think a lot of people really could have predicted that they would set up this system, kind of this 3-tiered system, the way that they set it up. But I do want to say this, that I was probably a lot more pessimistic than a lot of moderate to liberal guests that the U.S. Supreme Court would go this way. And I figured that they would get all 6 of them to go this way. And I also predicted that this would, as a practical matter, delay there ever being an election fraud, an election interference trial, the January 6th trial, that it would ever happen before the November election. And one last thing that I do want to say before it, because I didn't have a chance to say this last week. And by the way, I'm so glad you look so recovered. You look great, Mark.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. It was a rough ride, so thank you.
I said prayers for you, and I'm really happy to see you back and recovered. I know everybody watching your show is. But I said last week, and I do want to point this out again, that I actually predicted all the cases on your program that we did this year from the U.S. Supreme Court. I predicted the outcome. And the reason I was able to predict the outcome, I think, in large part, was I did try to do not what I wanted the decision to be, but what I thought the decision was going to be based on the oral arguments. Of course, after the oral argument, it's easier to predict than before the oral argument, although sometimes the mere fact that the U.S. Supreme Court takes a case, since generally speaking, they have discretion not to take any case they don't want to take. Once you saw that they'd taken the D.C. Circuit case, right there you knew that they were not going to just stand by what the D.C. Circuit had held. By the way, in this case, 3-0, including a Republican-appointed judge, unanimously, the D.C. Circuit had said, you can prosecute the president like you could prosecute anyone else after the president has been president. You have to do it on a case-by-case basis, evidence-by-evidence basis, as the evidence is actually presented at the trial. Once the Supreme Court took it, I thought it was pretty clear that they were going to do something different with it. But that was how I predicted, Chevron was going to come out the way that I don't personally, philosophically agree with. That was why I thought the January 6th obstruction case, that it was going to be held to be too vague a statute. And some all the other cases that I predicted accurately this term that we've discussed. So I do want to say that in Katz's defense.
Yes, no, Katzadamus has been very good, and I guess what I was trying to get at was simply that this was an overreach, it seemed to me, in a way. And I remembered you talking about the Nixon case. I thought you laid it out so well, and you also sort of talk about the way that the chief executive does have to be protected from certain kinds of decisions that the chief executive has to make, but. It seemed like an aggressive overreach to both protect this president, particularly because this president's case was actually noted, but also this new power that's conferred to the office is frightening, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely frightening, and it has changed really the understanding that all of us have had of what the separation of powers is. There's a famous book about the U.S. Supreme Court called The Least Dangerous Branch. And the author, this is a book written decades ago, but all of your law students who've been in federal courts and have planned to practice in the federal courts have read or heard about this book. And the idea is, of course, that the U.S. Supreme Court serves best when it's the least dangerous branch, that you worry about an imperial presidency. They used to worry about sort of an imperial Congress, kind of like in the United Kingdom, where if you've got both houses of parliament, you really rule the roost. There's no written constitution. There's no Supreme Court that seems to weigh in on the major issues of the day in the United Kingdom the way that they do here. So you can imagine an imperial legislature, an imperial presidency, but he imagined an imperial judiciary. And people are really worried that they have gone to that length, that they've made the president too strong, they've made themselves too strong, and they've made our rights too weak. I think what happened here is that there's two different views. There's
you got to do something.
Right.
Yeah.
There's two different views of what to worry about. And what the Republicans, the six of them, worry about is this, constant prosecution of the president or former president. And that a president would think, I'm going to get nibbled to death. That was kind of their thinking in the Nixon v. Fitzgerald case, that a former president would worry in office that the president would be nibbled to death after his or her term. But that, can you do 1 second?
Yeah, go do what you got to do. It's okay. We're right here. We're talking to David Katz, the former federal prosecutor, and we're talking about the presidential immunity ruling. I also want to get to Chevron deference, and we're basically right now, David's saying, hey, the concern was that, you're going to be essentially paralyzed as president if your concern is always going to be, how am I going to be prosecuted after I leave office?
Can I finish that thought?
Yeah,
Mark,
go ahead. I was just summarizing your thought. Yeah,
Mark, can I just finish that thought? Mark,
yeah, please. Yes.
Yeah. So they were really worried. They're concerned, and I don't fault anybody for this. I understand that there were political pressures. Let's say the DA, he won office. People in New York thought this is outrageous, that there should be some prosecution. But I think the fact that there were 4 prosecutions that were going on, 2 federal and 2 state, I think couldn't have helped but entered the 6 Republicans' minds that this is a real possibility, that not just this president, but other presidents will not only be nibbled to death, by civil suits, but the argument in Fitzgerald was that, well, that won't happen with prosecutions because there's so many checks on prosecutions. It's not just some guy like Fitzgerald filing a lawsuit, whether it's righteous or not. For his righteous lawsuit, there might be 20 others that weren't. And, the president has to defend after the president leaves office, all 21 of them. That's kind of the rationale of that. The fact that there were this proliferation of lawsuits, I think, was something that weighed much too heavily in the 6 justices' minds. Of course, the other side of it, the one that I subscribe to, the one that the 3 dissenters do, is that you really would have an authoritarian president. And there's all of these things. It's like the satires about, sending, the SEAL team to go kill your political rival. They didn't really deal with that. The majority does not deal with the fact that the president would say this was an official act, find some official purpose for it, only to talk to federal officials who were under the president's exercise and say, I was faithfully executing the law. That's the presidential power that I was exercising. I was faithfully executing the laws with other federal officials and could do awful things. And on that score, Justice Jackson, not this one, the Justice Jackson of such great fame decades ago in the Korematsu case, the case about the Japanese internment camps, he dissented and he said, look at this power that you're giving the president. The president basically can go. So what if we're at war? The president can go and intern tens of thousands of Japanese citizens. And the president can do that on their say-so because the president's executing the laws. This is a loaded gun, which a future president will shoot in awful ways. And that's, of course, the criticism of this case that I subscribe to, but I saw it coming because they had the 6 votes. What's interesting is that there's an aspect of the case which has an impact now in the New York case, the one that Trump was going to be sentenced on in a couple of days before the Republican National Convention, which he's now not going to be sentenced on for weeks and weeks because he's going to raise this issue. And this one sounds a little bit inside baseball, but this is really frightening. They didn't even get Amy Coney Barrett's vote on this one. This one split 5-4. And I'm, as though I'm usually a defender of the Chief Justice, I cannot believe what people may remember about the Chief Justice is that he joined this monstrosity, this dangerous case. And he could have not at least joined this part. It would have been 5-4 the other way. During the oral argument, Mark and Kim, he said that, certainly you can bring in evidence and you can talk about the official. I mean, how do you, he said, if a president takes $1 million to appoint an ambassador and you can show it's a bribe, how do you charge him with bribery, which is not an official act, being bribed, without mentioning that it was in exchange for this ambassadorship? Now he joined the decision which says, well, wait a second, you can't even refer to the official acts. There can be no evidence about a former president's official acts. So how would you even plead, but much less how would you show beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury that the president committed a non-official act of taking a bribe if you can't mention what it was in exchange for? It wouldn't make any sense. He received $10,000 out of, or $1 million out of thin air. The jury would think, well, wait a second, where's the quid pro quo? They showed a quid, they didn't show a quo, not guilty. You see, I was totally acquitted of everything, a Trump would say, a future Trump would say, totally acquitted, no basis for any of this stuff. He asked the question that showed that he got it during the oral argument, and then he switched. Even Amy Coney Barrett wouldn't have gone that far. And so because of this principle that you cannot present even any evidence of an official act, now they're saying in New York, wait a second, there was some evidence of some official acts in that New York Stormy Daniels case. There were things that the president did as he was president. Now they're going to argue all he did as president was write checks for the 12 different payments to Michael Cohen, which were a scam, which was a fraud, which was a falsification of records. He did that for the purpose of election interference. And they're going to say that that conviction ought to stand. I think that conviction in New York City will stand, but it's delayed it because Trump's attorneys ran immediately to court, which was good lawyering, given the fact that they now have this incredibly favorable decision that no evidence is supposed to be presented about official acts. They have that they can present to the judge. I think all it will do is delay the sentencing for a month or two, but that's going to be awfully fraught. And I've always said that I don't think that Trump is going to be sent to jail or even put on house arrest by this judge in New York City. And now with what looks like this decision, Trump's increasing chance of winning, God forbid, after the debacle of a debate performance by Biden, which hopefully he can do better in other things. I just don't see this New York City judge sending Trump to jail for even one day.
Yeah, well, it looks as though that sentencing has been, already put off, sort of in deference to, or certainly an acknowledgement of the latest Supreme Court ruling. Did you have something, Kim?
I had 2 questions, and I think they really were both covered, but I wanted to throw this up there because there was a headline on the Huffington Post last night that said the Supreme Court has given Joe Biden legal okay to assassinate Donald Trump. And I've seen the most kind of absurd, theories about what President Biden could do floated around. And I wonder if this is really true. I mean, is that what they did? Did they give him carte blanche to do something like this?
Well, you have to believe that the members of the military, having taken an oath to defend and protect the Constitution, would not carry out that order. But my God, that's the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, that we can't rely upon their rulings, but we have to rely on the fact that no military officer would actually carry out such an order. Of course, they could go to jail for it, right? And so the idea is that some subsequent president, some subsequent attorney general could prosecute them for having carried out that order, because it's so plainly unlawful. And it is plainly unlawful to do those sorts of things. I mean, even if you do have your attorney general there. But one of the very frightening things about the decision was they did say that anything having to do with the Department of Justice was off limits. So this incident with Jeffrey Clark, where they wanted to vault him over the acting attorney general and the deputy attorney general and make him the attorney general so that he could issue this false warning about alleged election irregularities in states like Georgia and other states that had already been clearly counted and decided and recounted, and that were in Biden's column and had voted for Biden, to suggest that there was election fraud in those cases and the Department of Justice was investigating it. And there seemed to be no other purpose but to vault that Jeffrey Clark over them. The president cannot be indicted for that. That has to be stricken from the indictment when it gets presented, because the fact that he spoke to another Department of Justice official, as a matter of law, it seems like he has an absolute immunity, that he was working with other federal officials and he was taking care of the law. Well, it's pretty obvious how you would then become a dictator. You would do things only through federal officials and say that you were carrying out the law. And if he never made the phone call, it's interesting. I think they can continue to prosecute him. And, if he loses the election, I think, because he'll dismiss the charges. If Trump gets back into power, he'll dismiss all these federal charges within a day or two. If he doesn't do it within the first 5 minutes. But if he does not get back into power and the prosecutions go forward, I think that he can be successfully prosecuted, found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, because he picked up the phone and he called that Georgia official. He did it himself. There was another Department of Justice official there, but he was talking to a state official. The Chief Justice Roberts, in his decision for the 6th, he did give some avenue to continue to prosecute, because he said there are things that the president does running for office or as a party leader that he can be prosecuted for. And so a lot of this conduct is going to be argued to be that this was running for office. This was as a political candidate trying to get reelected, and was not the office of the president's core responsibilities. But remember, the 3-part test is for something totally private. He goes outside the White House. He finds out that somebody else is fooling around with Melania, and he punches him in the nose. That's not official, and a president can be prosecuted for that. Okay. There's this core one, which is going to cover an awful lot of stuff. And that's absolute immunity. And that's what they said as to dealings with the Department of Justice officials, even though he had a bad motive. They said you cannot bring in the bad motive or evidence about motive of a former president because it gets too close to this zone. It will freeze, that will have all these weak presidents. And what's amazing? Every president, until this decision was issued on Monday, every single president knew if they committed a violation of criminal law, they could be prosecuted federally after they were president. Every single one of them. Have we had weak presidents? We've had FDR. We had Trump in his first term. We had Obama. We had all of these presidents who were definitely, Lyndon Johnson, they weren't weak at all. They weren't frozen in the performance of their duties. This is all made up out of, I won't say out of whole cloth, because they're good enough lawyers that they found little strands from earlier decisions, right? Like Nixon v. Fitzgerald, even Marbury v. Madison, the famous old case from the early 1800s. The Nixon tapes case, let me mention the Nixon tapes case. While they took things from all of those cases, they basically overruled the Nixon tapes case. If that had been the law, Nixon wouldn't have turned over the tapes. Nixon wouldn't have resigned his office. What
Nixon wouldn't have needed to turn over the tapes.
Mark, I'm older than you, but what we've known our whole lives, that even a president has to comply with a subpoena, that even Nixon had to resign, that his own Republican senators went to him and said, it's over. You broke the law. Get out before we impeach you. Okay. Nixon, they basically overruled a sub rosa, not by saying so, but the intent of it, by reading it, you realize that this case basically would have had Nixon come out the other way and he wouldn't have resigned. So that's all my thoughts. I kind of gushed them out. So please ask your questions.
No, that's great.
Sorry.
I mean, I led the show yesterday talking about the deal that essentially informed the closing days of the Trump administration, in which he had gotten rid of Barr, had put in a henchman there in the Attorney General post at Justice, and then he said, "Look, I need you to, discuss the fact, or even if it's not, I don't worry about getting the evidence now. Just talk about the fact that you're investigating fraud in the last election." And it was such an obvious. And that was really where he was facing a kind of Justice Department revolt over that. Now that would completely be covered by the kind of immunity that came down. Can you? He
said to Clark and the others, just say you're investigating and let me and the Republican congressman take it from there. Yeah. But you see, you couldn't even bring that in to show his bad motive. In other words, once the president says it's really, really scary. And of course, if you need another reason to vote for the Democratic candidate, whether it's Biden or someone else, and not Trump, it's still a two-way race. There's only two possibilities. Trump gets it or the Democratic nominee gets it. And everything else, RFK Jr. staying home, you're voting for Trump. RFK Jr., you're staying home, you're voting for Trump. Yeah. And the powers that he would have after this decision, and the way he's already said that he would use them in a second term, people really need to think long and hard that it's not rhetoric about saving our democracy. Our democracy really is on the chopping block in this election.
Did you have something, Kim? I'm sorry.
I do. And you kind of touched on this earlier, but I just kind of want to clarify in this New York hush money case, where there's now a delay in the sentencing phase of this trial. Is it? It seems to me that the whole hush money thing happened before Trump ever became president, but you talked about how he wrote the checks while he was in office. Does the entire case hinge on the check writing? Pardon me, is that why it's in jeopardy now?
Well, he wrote tweets, I think, while he was in the Oval Office. And he made other kinds of communications. And they're going to say that should not have come in under the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. Because remember, the U.S. Supreme Court, having ruled, their rulings apply to every case in the country, state as well as federal. It applies to the Georgia case and it applies to the New York case. And so they said, look, now that we have this clarification, this actually radical decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, none of the evidence about what he did while he was president should have come into trial at all. This case had to be proved only with evidence that did not include any official acts. And so Trump is going to try to characterize some of what came into evidence as being official acts or being in this presumptive zone, this middle zone. He's going to say that the presumption was not overcome, therefore that evidence, but by the prosecution in New York City, therefore that evidence should not have come in. The evidence that should not have come in was harmful. It was not harmless error. Had the case been presented to a jury without the evidence that should not have come in against Trump, there might have been a different verdict. And if the judge says, yes, I think there's really a reasonable possibility or probability, I'm not sure what the standard is there in New York City, of there having been a different verdict, the way we cure that is with a new trial. And of course, a new trial in New York City would be a fiasco, especially if he's president at the time. I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that the power of a president, and greatly enhanced by this decision, but the power of the president is just overwhelming. I mean, it's one thing for Trump to say right now that he thinks that Liz Cheney should be brought before a military tribunal on treason charges. I mean, it's just, it's a madman, talking. That madman becomes president, okay? you really wonder what's going on. He's the commander in chief. He's in charge of the military tribunals. They've never been, great in terms of, evidentiary, punctiliousness. At least that's how people see them. They don't see them as fair as trials. They're certainly not a jury trial, not a normal jury. So the power, and that's the other thing with these folks down in Atlanta. You say, well, he doesn't have the power to pardon himself or do anything about the Atlanta case because it's in state court. But my goodness, the power of a president doing all of these things under this new decision. I mean, it's very intimidating. It doesn't matter how smart you are. I was a federal prosecutor. We were brave. We were smart. We were fearless. My God, to have the president of the United States, Trump, back in office and want to get you. Boy, I would not want to be. I don't think anyone who would want to be those prosecutors or police officers or anybody working on the case down in Atlanta or New York City against them, even though he technically doesn't have the power to pardon himself.
Look what he did to Vindman after his testimony in the House before the House committee. It was unbelievable. I mean, he essentially locked Vindman out of his entitled pension from the government. This guy served in the armed forces. I wanted you to play. He did that to those
FBI officials. Remember, he did that to those top FBI officials. He went through the FBI, America's, so prestigious law enforcement agency. You look at that. I think he cleaned Comey, the fellow under him, who's now a commentator. All these people, he cleaned them out of the FBI. I mean, they're also fearless, But wow, you start looking around it and you think, wow, I'm a subordinate, and I look up above me, and 7 of the 8 people have been removed by this president. One way or the other, 7 of the 8 people running the FBI don't seem to be here anymore, and they seem to have all pissed off Trump, and they're not here anymore.
Right, and these people have families, and these are real people too. This isn't they're not one-dimensional.
That guy won his pension back. The number 2 under Comey, he won his pension back.
And I believe Vindman might have gotten his after that, or I know he was trying to.
But of course, Trump says, Mark, that's the deep state. He wants to get rid of all those deep state people who
will get rid of
adjudications, who've given their lives to serving in the federal government, not because of partisanship, but because of a sense of duty. I mean, I know people may think it's maudlin. It's not maudlin. I've worked in the federal government, and people are there, generally speaking, because of their sense of duty. They want to do the right thing and not to railroad somebody from the Republicans or from the Democrats. And of course, Trump treats it like everybody who takes a fair look at anything that he wants to do and doesn't agree with what Trump wants to do is an enemy of the people and should be separated from federal service at the least.
Imagine making part, I'm just glad you mentioned this. I've been meaning to mention, I wanted to mention it yesterday. I'll just mention it now. It's sort of adjacent to what you're talking about. Imagine mentioning as part of your campaign stump speeches and making it a centerpiece of interviews that you want retribution. I mean, to me, it's utterly absurd. I mean, you're supposed to, in Sponge Trump, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do for you, the American people. I'm going to make your life better. I'm going to lower taxes, lower costs at the grocery store, whatever the price, I'm going to do all of these things that these generally empty promises oftentimes are made. The notion that you would get up on a stump and you would say, let me tell you something, I'm going to take revenge for you. My revenge is your revenge. I mean, it's absurd. It's the sort of rising despotism that I find incredibly scary. I know we've kept you over time. I really appreciate you being here.
Can I mention one more thing too?
Yeah.
Because you've talked about the Mar-a-Lago case. And, it's just such a pity. The Mar-a-Lago case could have started, and, as I say, if you read Nixon v. Fitzgerald, which you might not like the case, but it was decided, there it was. It was probably the closest precedent. If Jack Smith had read that case and pleaded the Mar-a-Lago indictment without anything, forget taking the documents, okay? It just starts with the day after Trump is president. Starts with the day after he's president, January 21st. And is filed in Washington, D.C. It would have had no presidential immunity. Now, again, he would have had to be a little bit clairvoyant to have tried the case, okay? But he's got a lot of smart lawyers say, you know what? Let's stay away from anything that had to do with, I think he would have been allowed to prove in the case that Trump acquired the documents. Maybe even how he acquired them wouldn't be relevant. We raided this place in Mar-a-Lago, and we found all these documents that had been taken from Washington, D.C. After subpoenaing them back, doing everything we could to get them back, he didn't turn them back. his own lawyer was subject to the not the attorney-client privilege, but the crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege. He gave us this testimony. None of this relates to when he was president. None of these are acts about president. Here's a fellow who's no longer president, who has all these top national security documents. He files that thing in Washington, D.C., and I think that could have changed the course of history.
I totally agree. It's game over if it's filed in Washington, D.C. You know how I feel about that. We agree. And it literally could have been, as you just said, the only case that Jack Smith filed, and everything else could have just been in the on-deck circle, and it would have been a totally different world.
A willful U.S. Supreme Court was always bound and determined to find some way to shield Trump. If you have that view that there are two radical right-wingers on there, Alito and Thomas, and there are three people who were appointed by Trump, and their appreciation for being on the U.S. Supreme Court to be this enormous part of history is so huge itself that those five would have done Trump's bidding no matter what. They would have found a way. Of course, Trump would have appealed whatever was about to happen in the Mar-a-Lago case.
But
so I guess in that sense,
but the reality,
they would have found some way. They would have found some way to always have ruled for Trump, to have always carried water for Trump, just like they did on his tax returns for over 2 years. They would have carried this water for Trump. So don't even blame Jack Smith on that.
But the stink of taking the documents and the stink that would have come out as the case was discussed, that was a big stink, and it's inexplicable why you take thousands of classified military documents to your home. That, I think, that stink he couldn't have gotten away from. He could have legally gotten away from it, but I think it would have damaged him. Play for him quickly on the way out, Tony, that thing we've been sitting on. We just gotten into a conversation. These are all of the Supreme Court justices telling you how everyone answers to the law in this country. No man or woman is above the law.
No one's above the law in the United States. That's a foundational principle that I've talked about, coming from Federalist 69, coming from the structure of the Constitution.
I don't think the president is above the law. No person in this country, no matter how high or powerful, is above the law.
I believe that no one is above the law under our system, and that includes the president. The president is fully bound by the law.
No man is above the law.
Does he have that power?
No man is above the law, Senator.
I agree. No one is above the law.
No one.
So they're all your conservative justices. Yeah, except, oh, wait a minute. We'll take a meeting on that, I guess, because apparently the president of the United States is above the law. David, thank you. Have a great holiday, and I appreciate you stopping through on this remarkable week. America really changed, and it sounds like, you know, media recharacterizing something in some sort of clickbaity way, but it's not that. It really is that bad. David Katz, the former federal prosecutor. Yeah.
Happy 4th to everyone, and I'll say it on every show of yours if I remember to. Go out and vote. Go out and vote on November 5th. Go out and vote. The country's fate depends on it.
Exactly right. David Katz, everybody. Thanks, David. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.